Welcome to qnawire.
Alright, let's make some calculations. First, the mean for each treatment in block. So for Walmart, the mean is 15. For Starbucks, the mean is 18. For the Gap, the mean is 16.5, and the overall mean is 16. The total sum of squares is the difference between 12 and 16 squared, and 17 and 16 squared, 13 and 16 squared, 16 and 16 squared, 18 and 16 squared, and 17 and 14 and 17 and 17 and 18 and 20 and 19, and that all adds up to 66. And the sum of squares for rows is 4 times the difference of the squares for 15, 18, and 16 and a half times 4, which is 21. The sum of the squares for the columns would be 3 times the difference of 14 and 16 squared, 17 and 16 squared, 16 and 16 squared, and 19 and 16 squared, which is 42. The error sum of squares is 3. The total degrees of freedom would be 12 minus 1, or 11. The degrees of freedom for the rows is 3 minus 1, or 2. The degrees of freedom for the columns is 4 minus 1, or 3. And the degrees of freedom for the errors would be 3 minus 1 times 4 minus 1, or 2 times 3, which is 6. So the MSR is the SSR over the degrees of freedom for the rows, which is 10.5. The mean squares for the columns is the sum of square of the columns over the degrees of freedom for the columns, which is 14. And the mean square for the errors is the sum of square for the errors over the degrees of freedom for the errors, which is 0.5. The F ratios, for rows, would be the mean square for the rows over the mean square for the errors, which is 21, and the F ratio for the columns would be the mean square for the columns over the mean square for the errors, which is 28. For an alpha of 0.05, the critical value for F rows with 2 degrees and 6 degrees of freedom, and the critical value for the columns is 3 and 6. And this would be 7.26. And for columns, um, 6.60. And if the calculated F value is greater, then we reject the null hypothesis. So we would reject the null hypothesis. So for A, since the F columns exceeds the critical value, there is a significant block effect. Similarly, if since the F rows column exceeds the critical value, there is a significant difference between the treatments. Is there evidence of a difference in the mean score across the 3 retail scores? So we would look at the F rows value and compare it with the critical value from the F distribution at a 5% significance level. And since it exceeds it, there is a significant difference between the retail stores. If there is a significant difference, we perform a post hoc test like the Tukey's HSD to identify which specific groups differ. To use Tukey's HSD tests, we would calculate the standard error. And so the standard error would be the mean square error over the square root of the mean square error over the number of shoppers, which is 0.354. And the critical value from the Tukey distribution table for 3 groups and 6 degrees of freedom for errors is about 4.34. And so we use 4.34 and multiply by the standard error and get 1.54. When we compare the absolute differences between the pairs of means with the HSD value, and the difference between Walmart and Starbucks, which is 3, is greater than 1.54. So there's a significant difference for Walmart. The difference between Walmart and the Gap is 1.5. And that's not greater than 1.54, and neither is between Starbucks and the Gap. So there's a significant difference between Walmart and Starbucks.